The entire showroom froze the moment a mechanic in oil-stained coveralls placed his bare hand on the hood of the world's most expensive machine. Every conversation died. Every champagne glass paused mid-air. The silence that followed was the kind that only arrives when something deeply wrong has just happened in a room full of people who have never experienced anything deeply wrong in their entire lives. Then the voice cut through sharp, precise, and carrying the particular authority of someone who had never once doubted herself. "Security, get him away from that car." The female CEO's command echoed across 2 floors of polished glass, and before the mechanic could draw another breath, 3 men in dark suits were already moving toward him. Employees standing along the perimeter smirked. Guests near the velvet ropes quietly pulled out their phones. Within 30 seconds, the mechanic was publicly humiliated and fired in front of 400 of the most powerful people in the automotive world. Nobody asked why he had touched the car. Nobody bothered. But 5 minutes later, when the $200 million prototype refused to start before the largest gathering of global investors the company had ever assembled, the same woman who fired him would find herself walking out of that glass palace with something she had never carried before: desperation, and searching the parking lot for the one person she had just destroyed. Voss Automotive was not simply a car company. It was, by every measurable standard, the most ambitious engineering project in the history of private transportation. A firm built on the belief that the future of speed did not belong to governments or aerospace conglomerates, but to a single obsessive vision pursued without compromise. Founded 18 years earlier, in a leased warehouse outside of Detroit, Voss had grown from a 12-person prototype shop into a globally recognized brand whose waiting lists stretched across 3 continents. Their vehicles were not purchased. They were awarded. Buyers underwent a vetting process more rigorous than most security clearances, and even those who passed often waited years before a car bearing the Voss emblem arrived at their door. The company's reputation was built on one unbreakable promise: perfection before performance. Every bolt torqued to specification, every seam laser-aligned, every system tested under conditions that would have destroyed any other manufacturer's equipment before the first test mile was even logged. That reputation had taken nearly 2 decades to construct, and on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, the company prepared to stake the entirety of it on a single vehicle: the Voss Meridian, a hypercar so far beyond the existing category that the company's marketing team had spent 3 months debating whether to invent an entirely new classification for it. The Meridian was not simply fast. It was a reimagining of what a road-legal machine could theoretically be: a ground-up engineering exercise that had consumed 5 years of development, over $1.2 billion in research funding, and the combined intellectual output of 63 engineers across 4 countries. Its powertrain combined a twin-turbocharged internal combustion core with a solid-state battery array of a design that had never before appeared in a production vehicle. The thermal management system alone contained more computing power than the average commercial aircraft. At full output, the Meridian produced figures that the engineering team themselves still occasionally argued about over dinner. The prototype sitting in the Voss Global Headquarters showroom that Tuesday morning was the only complete example in existence, and it was valued at $200 million, a figure that reflected not merely the cost of its components, but the irreplaceable nature of the intellectual property embedded in every system it contained. The launch event had been 18 months in the planning. 240 confirmed attendees representing sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, legacy automotive manufacturers, and technology conglomerates had flown in from 17 countries. Press credentials had been issued to 61 journalists from the most influential automotive and financial publications in the world. 2 separate broadcast crews were already live streaming to audiences across Europe and Southeast Asia. The showroom itself had been transformed: white marble floors polished to a mirror finish, architectural lighting suspended from the 4-story atrium ceiling, a raised presentation platform constructed at the north end of the space, where the Meridian sat beneath a draped cover of carbon fiber weave cloth, waiting. Every detail had been controlled down to the ambient temperature of the room, which had been set at precisely 68 degrees, to ensure the leather interior of the prototype would carry the exact scent the fragrance consultant had determined would leave the most lasting impression on buyers of significant, means standing at the center of all of it, reviewing her presentation notes one final time, was Margaret Calloway. At 38 years old, Margaret was the youngest chief executive in Voss's history, appointed to the role 4 years earlier after orchestrating a restructuring that had saved the company from a liquidity crisis so severe it had come within 11 days of a complete operational shutdown. She was brilliant, relentless, and had an almost physical intolerance for imprecision. Employees who had worked under her for years described the experience in similar terms. She raised the ceiling for everyone around her and then stood directly beneath it with a stopwatch. She was not cruel, exactly, but she was certain, and that certainty had a gravity to it that made disagreement feel less like a difference of opinion and more like a structural miscalculation. She had remade Voss in her image over 4 years, leaner, faster, more ruthless in its pursuit of excellence, and the Meridian launch was, in her own private estimation, the finest moment she had engineered in her professional life. She intended to protect it, on the far side of the showroom floor, past the display barriers and the security checkpoints and the temporary lighting rigs, down a utility corridor that smelled of coolant and carbon dust. A man named Ray Kowalski was making his third pass around the Meridian's transport cradle. Ray was 51 years old. He had been with Voss for 22 years, longer than any other non-executive employee on the payroll, and he had spent the majority of that time doing the same thing he was doing at that moment, listening. Not to people, though he listened to those too. To machines. Ray had a quality that could not be taught in any engineering program and could not be replicated by any diagnostic software yet developed. He understood mechanical systems, the way some people understood language, intuitively, beneath the level of conscious analysis, in a way that arrived as feeling before it arrived as thought. His hands were large and permanently stained at the knuckles with grease that no amount of industrial solvent had fully removed in over 2 decades of work. His coveralls bore the Voss logo on the chest pocket, faded from repeated industrial washing. He had no title beyond senior technician, a designation that had not changed in 11 years despite the fact that virtually every critical system failure the company had faced in that period had ultimately been resolved by him. The younger engineers respected him. Most of the management team had no idea who he was. Ray was the kind of person that organizations like Voss depend on completely and acknowledge almost never the load-bearing wall that everyone walks past without noticing until the day it is removed. He had joined Voss at 29, 2 years after completing a mechanical engineering apprenticeship at a regional manufacturing plant in Ohio, and he had come to the company not through a recruiting firm or a university placement office, but through a single phone call from a production supervisor who had watched him diagnose a catastrophic gearbox failure in 40 minutes that had stumped a team of degreed engineers for 3 days. That supervisor, a man named Howard Briggs, who had since retired to coastal Florida, had told Voss's then head of operations that Ray Kowalski understood machines the way musicians understand sound, not as a collection of components to be analyzed, but as a unified system to be heard. Howard had not been wrong. Over 22 years, Ray had rebuilt prototypes that were considered total losses, identified fatigue patterns in materials that had passed every standard inspection, and twice prevented test failures that would have resulted in serious injury to evaluation drivers. He had never been formally credited for any of these interventions in the company's official records. In each case, the resolution had been attributed to the engineering team, with Ray's contribution noted, if at all, in internal documentation that no executive had ever read. He had not complained about this, or not in ways that registered above the threshold of institutional attention. He had simply continued to show up, to listen, and to fix what needed fixing, because that was the work, and the work was what mattered, and he had made his peace with the particular invisibility that skilled people in unglamorous roles carry as a standard condition of employment in organizations that have learned to sort their people by credential rather than by capability. He had arrived 3 hours before the official event setup began, as he always did before any public demonstration of a vehicle he had worked on. He did not do this because he was required to. He did it because it was the only way he could sleep the night before. As he moved around the Meridian that morning, His trained ear caught something that had no business being there, a faint, intermittent harmonic resonance emanating from the lower rear quarter of the vehicle, in the region where the thermal management conduits for the battery array interfaced with the primary drive actuators. It was not loud. It was barely audible above the ambient noise of the showroom preparation. But Ray had heard a version of that sound once before, on a prototype test rig 7 years ago, 48 hours before a thermal runaway event that had destroyed $300,000 of equipment and very nearly taken the left hand of a young technician who had been standing too close. He crouched beside the vehicle and pressed his fingertips lightly against the lower rocker panel, feeling for the vibration signature beneath the paint. It was there. Subtle, rhythmic, completely wrong. He straightened up and went to find the lead engineer. The engineering team assigned to the Meridian's launch preparation was young, credentialed, and extremely confident. Marcus Webb, the project lead, was 32 years old, held a doctorate in applied thermodynamics from Carnegie Mellon, and had joined Voss directly from a prestigious fellowship at a national research laboratory. He was talented, and he knew it, which under most circumstances was an asset. He listened to Ray's description of the harmonic resonance for approximately 90 seconds before explaining, with carefully measured patience, that the diagnostic suite connected to the Meridian had returned nominal readings across all monitored parameters for the past 72 hours, and that a tactile sensation reported by a technician without instrumentation did not constitute grounds for halting a launch event of this magnitude. 2 other engineers in the room nodded. One of them, a young woman named Dana Park, who had graduated top of her class the previous year and had been on the Meridian project for 8 months, did not nod. She looked at Ray for a moment with an expression that sat somewhere between uncertainty and the professional caution that comes from not yet knowing which instincts to trust. Then she looked at her tablet and said nothing. Ray asked if anyone had checked the calibration on the thermal sensors in Sector 4 of the battery housing. Marcus said that the system had been calibrated on Friday and rechecked Saturday morning. Ray said that he thought the calibration might be drifting, and that the reading they were seeing as nominal might be masking an actual temperature variance of 8 to 12 degrees in a localized cluster. Marcus said, very politely and with complete finality, that the event would proceed as planned, and that Ray was welcome to watch from the observation area with the other technicians. Ray walked back out to the showroom floor. He stood near the east wall for a long time, watching the room fill up around him. The caterers arrived. The press pool was arranged along the north barrier. Guests in suits that cost more than Ray's monthly salary began drifting through the entrance doors in clusters, accepting glasses and exchanging the particular brand of casual conversation that people engage in when they are secretly calculating everyone else's net worth. The lighting above the Meridian shifted from neutral white to a dramatic amber that made the vehicle's carbon fiber body panels seem to absorb and release light simultaneously, like something alive. The event producer's assistant counted down on a headset near the stage. Somewhere behind the presentation platform, Margaret Calloway was being handed final talking points by her communications director. Ray looked at the car. He had spent parts of 14 months working on the systems embedded in that vehicle, not the glamorous work, not the headline engineering, but the unglamorous essential work, the routing of thermal conduits, the calibration of pressure relief sequences, the integration of the battery management controller with the legacy drive system architecture. He knew where every wire ran and why. He knew which engineer had made which decision and which of those decisions had been made in haste and which had been made with care. And standing there in the amber light with 400 people filing into the room around him, he felt something that was not anxiety. Exactly, but was adjacent to it, the specific discomfort of a person who knows something important that no one around them is prepared to hear. He crossed the floor. He did not cross it quickly or with any intention of being dramatic. He walked at his normal pace, which was deliberate and unhurried in the way of someone who has spent 22 years moving around expensive machinery in tight spaces. He reached the front quarter of the Meridian and placed his right hand on the hood, just ahead of the A-pillar, in the spot where the thermal conduit from Sector 3 of the battery array ran closest to the exterior surface. He pressed down gently and held the contact. reading the temperature differential through his palm, the way a doctor reads a pulse, not for a number, but for a character. The surface was warm in a pattern that was uneven, in a way it should not have been. He moved his hand 3 inches toward the center of the hood and felt the temperature drop back to where it should have been. He moved it back. The warmth returned. Localized. Asymmetric. Wrong. The voice arrived before he had time to straighten up. Security, get him away from that car. Margaret Calloway had seen the man in the stained coveralls cross her showroom floor and put his hands on the vehicle that represented the single most important commercial moment in her company's history, approximately 45 seconds before the start of the globally live-streamed presentation. She had seen it from the elevated platform where she was standing for a final microphone check, and what she had seen or believed she had seen was a technician violating the absolute security perimeter around the Meridian in full view of 400 guests and 61 members of the international press. What she had not seen, because she was not close enough and because she had no framework for interpreting what she was observing, was a man performing a diagnostic. 3 security personnel arrived at Ray's position in under 10 seconds. The nearest one placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Ray did not resist. He straightened up, turned around, and looked at Margaret Calloway with an expression that contained no anger, no embarrassment, and no particular surprise. He had been looked at that way before, by people in that kind of room. He was used to the math of it, the rapid, unconscious calculation that people in expensive clothing perform when they encounter a man in stained coveralls who has just touched something valuable. The events manager appeared. The HR director materialized from somewhere near the catering station. A cluster of guests nearby shifted in the subtle choreography of people who want to watch something uncomfortable without appearing to want to watch it. Someone near the press barrier raised a camera. Ray was guided, firmly, but without physical force, back from the vehicle and toward the service corridor entrance. He tried twice to speak, once to the security team and once directly to Margaret Calloway, who was now descending from the platform with the composed fury of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in information that might complicate it. The second time he spoke, she stopped. She looked at him. Not at his face, exactly, more at the totality of him. The coveralls, the stained knuckles, the absence of anything that resembled the profile of someone who should be standing in the center of her showroom on the most important day of her professional life. "I want to explain," Ray said. "There's a thermal anomaly in Sector 4 of the battery housing. The car should not be started until the calibration on sensors 17 through 22 has been verified." The HR director said, "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." Margaret said, "You are fired. Effective this moment. Please surrender your credentials and leave the premises." The room had gone quiet enough that several nearby guests heard both exchanges. Someone laughed. Softly. The camera near the press barrier was still raised. Ray looked at Margaret for a moment longer, not with defiance, not with the compressed contempt of a man cataloging an injustice for future use, but with the particular calm of someone who has said what needed to be said and accepted that it was not going to be received. He reached into his chest pocket and removed his ID badge. He held it out. The HR director took it. Ray nodded once, not at anyone in particular, more a private gesture of internal accounting, and said, quietly but clearly enough, that 4 people around him heard it, "That car should not be started." Then he turned and walked toward the service corridor door, and the room exhaled around him, and the event producer's assistant counted down from 10 on his headset, and the amber lighting above the Meridian pulsed imperceptibly warmer, and Margaret Calloway walked back to the platform and picked up the microphone. The presentation was everything she had planned it to be. 16 minutes of precisely crafted narrative, moving from the history of Voss through the engineering philosophy that had produced the Meridian and arriving at the vehicle itself with the kind of rhetorical momentum that made even experienced financial professionals feel something approaching genuine excitement. The applause at each checkpoint was real. The questions from the press pool during the brief open segment were the right kind of questions, probing but manageable. The questions of people who were already converted and simply wanted confirmation. When Margaret reached the finale of her remarks and gestured to the two Voss engineers positioned at the Meridian's driver's door with the instruction to begin the start sequence, the room was poised at exactly the pitch of anticipation she had constructed it to reach. She stepped back from the podium. The draped cover had already been removed 20 minutes earlier. The Meridian sat in the amber light, its surfaces so precisely finished that they seemed to exist at a level of physical reality slightly more resolved than the room around it. One of the engineers opened the driver's door and settled into the seat. The second engineer connected the external initialization interface and entered the start authorization code. The dashboard illuminated, and then nothing happened. Not nothing in the sense of silence. The system made noise. A series of initialization tones that were the correct tones in the correct sequence, which was somehow worse than complete silence because it meant the car was trying. It was simply unable to complete the attempt. The powertrain management controller cycled through its startup sequence and stopped at step 7 of 14, at the point where it was required to receive a thermal clearance confirmation from the battery management system before permitting current flow to the drive motors. The confirmation did not come. The thermal management system had detected a localized temperature variance in Sector 4 of the battery housing, a variance that measured 11 degrees above the expected baseline, asymmetric in distribution, consistent with a miscalibrated sensor that had been reporting a false nominal for approximately 72 hours, while an actual temperature differential developed beneath its blind spot. The safety protocol, which was one of the most rigorously designed subsystems in the entire vehicle, did exactly what it had been designed to do. It refused to allow the car to start. The engineer in the driver's seat tried the sequence again. The same result. He tried a manual override for the secondary startup pathway. The system declined it. He looked up from the dashboard and found Marcus Webb's eyes in the crowd. Marcus Webb, standing 6 feet from the press barrier with a tablet, showing a cascade of yellow and red status indicators that had not existed 3 minutes ago, looked back with an expression that had lost all of its earlier composed confidence and replaced it with something that was rapidly approaching controlled panic. He pulled up the thermal data from Sector 4 on his tablet and stared at it for 4 seconds. Then he looked at the back of the room where the service corridor door was. The guests nearest to the Meridian had already registered that something was wrong. The event producer was in Margaret's ear, speaking in the low, urgent tone that professionals use when they are trying to communicate crisis without creating it visually. Margaret kept her expression exactly as it had been: calm, authoritative, in command, because she had not survived what she had survived in 4 years as chief executive by allowing her face to become a liability. She walked to Marcus Webb and spoke to him in a voice low enough that only he could hear it. He showed her the tablet. She looked at the numbers for a moment. Then she said, "Fix it." Marcus said, "We're working on it." She said, "How long?" He said, "I don't know." She said, "That is not an acceptable answer." He said, "Because there was no other answer available to him. The person who knows this system best is not here." There was a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. "Who?" Margaret said. Dana Park, who was standing behind Marcus and had heard every word, said quietly, "Ray Kowalski." "The technician who was." She stopped. Margaret looked at her. Dana finished. "The one you fired." 20 minutes ago, the engineering team worked for 14 minutes in full view of the assembled investors, press, and guests. 14 minutes during which the event producer cycled through the prepared contingency content supplementary footage, in a secondary presentation on Voss's manufacturing philosophy. While the murmur in the room shifted from confusion to the particular low-grade unease that precedes a consensus conclusion, one of the senior investors near the front, a man representing a fund with a $900 million stake in the Meridian's commercial success, checked his watch twice and said something to his associate that made them both look toward the exit. The live stream, which was still running to audiences across 2 continents, had accumulated enough visible distress in the foreground of its frame to generate a comment volume that the company's social media monitoring team would later describe as unprecedented for a product launch event. Margaret Calloway stood at the edge of the presentation platform and watched her engineering team fail in real time, with the same expression she would have maintained if none of it were happening. After 14 minutes, an engineer named Gerald Hoffman, 61 years old, the most senior technical employee remaining on the floor, put down his tablet and looked at Margaret. Gerald had been with Voss for 16 years. He had watched Ray Kowalski quietly solve more unfixable problems than he could count on both hands. And he had spent 20 minutes saying nothing because he understood the room and he understood his position in it. But 14 minutes of public failure had clarified his priorities. He said, "The only person in this building who fully understands the integration architecture between the thermal management controller and the battery array startup protocol is Ray Kowalski. He built the calibration framework for that exact system. He told us this morning the sensor calibration was drifting in Sector 4. We did not listen to him." He paused. "We should find him." The room absorbed this statement in its own way. A few engineers looked at the floor. Marcus Webb did not look anywhere in particular. The investor near the front checked his watch a third time. Margaret Calloway held Gerald's gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was, and in that moment, something passed through her expression that those closest to her would later describe differently. Some said it was the look of a person realizing they had made a mistake. Others said it was the look of a person calculating whether there was any route available that did not require them to admit they had made a mistake. And a few said it was both of those things at the same time, arriving simultaneously and in conflict. Then she stepped off the platform and walked, alone, to the service corridor door. The parking structure beneath the Voss headquarters building was a 3-level underground facility, used primarily by technical and operations staff. Ray had parked his truck on the second level, in the same space he had been using for 11 years, a habit born of the particular preference mechanics developed for positions near load-bearing columns, where the risk of door damage from adjacent vehicles is minimized. He was sitting on the truck's tailgate when Margaret found him, his tool case open beside him, methodically checking the contents and replacing items in their designated slots in the way that people in manual professions do when they need something orderly to do with their hands. He had a thermos of coffee. He was not on his phone. He did not appear to be in distress. Margaret walked toward him across the concrete floor in heels that had been engineered for presentation stages, not parking garage ramps. She stopped approximately 8 feet away. She had rehearsed nothing. She was not accustomed to needing to rehearse apologies because she was not accustomed to being in the wrong in ways that were public and verifiable and time-sensitive. Ray looked at her. He said nothing. "The car won't start," Margaret said. "I know," Ray said. There was a pause. "We need you to come back," she said. Ray placed a torque wrench into its slot in the tool case and pressed the foam surround down around it with 2 fingers. He did not look up from the case. "You fired me," he said. "In front of 400 people, and the international press." "Yes," Margaret said. There was no inflection on the word, no apology yet, no justification, just the flat acknowledgement of a fact she was not disputing. "My daughter is in 4th grade, Ray said. She heard about it from one of her classmates, whose parents were at the event. She called me while I was getting my truck. She asked me if I lost my job. He picked up a calibration tool, checked its tip, set it back down. I told her yes. Margaret said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry for that. Are you asking me to come back?" Ray said, "because the car won't start and you need me? Or are you asking me because what happened up there was wrong?" It was, Margaret would later describe to her executive coach, the most precise question she had been asked in 4 years of running a company. She was a person who had learned to move through complexity by separating the professional from the personal, the strategic from the emotional, the outcome from the process. Ray's question did not allow that separation. It required her to locate, specifically, what she actually felt, and to say it out loud, in a parking garage, to a man sitting on a tailgate with a cup of thermos coffee, without the benefit of a communications director, or prepared remarks, or the authority gradient that normally organized her conversations. She stood there for a long moment. "Both," she said. "Both are true." Ray looked at her then, fully, for the first time since she had walked down the ramp. He studied her face the same way he studied instruments, looking for the character of what was there, rather than the reading it was producing. "I'll come back," he said. "But not for the car." Margaret waited. "You need to hear everything," Ray said. "After the car. All of it. Not from me, from Gerald, from Dana. From anyone else who has been doing the work that nobody with a title has been looking at. You sit in a room, and you listen. And then the people responsible for what happened this morning stand up in front of the company and say what they got wrong. Not a press statement. In person." He closed the tool case. "That's the condition." She did not hesitate. "Agreed," she said. "And my daughter finds out from me that I went back because I chose to," Ray said. "Not because I was called back. That part matters." "Understood," Margaret said. Ray picked up his tool case and his thermos. He stood up. "Then let's go fix the car," he said. He said it without triumph, without the particular satisfaction that the situation arguably entitled him to feel. Later, when people who had heard the story asked him what he had been thinking in that parking garage in the 40 minutes between being fired and being asked to return, he would say that he had mostly been thinking about the sensor calibration, that some part of his mind had stayed with the problem even while the human drama around it had been concluding. The way a doctor keeps monitoring a patient's vital signs through the surrounding noise of a difficult family conversation. He had known, with a quiet and complete certainty, that the issue in Sector 4 was exactly what he had described to Marcus Webb that morning. And he had known what the fix required, and some portion of his attention had been allocated to holding that knowledge steady and organized, ready to be used, while the rest of him dealt with the more unwieldy business of having been publicly humiliated and dismissed in front of an international audience. He was not, by nature, a person who dwelt in grievance. He had grown up in a working-class household in western Pennsylvania, where problems were addressed rather than litigated, where the measure of a person was found in what they did when circumstances were difficult, rather than in how justified their frustration was. That upbringing had given him something that 22 years in professional environments had repeatedly confirmed the value of: the ability to remain functional in the gap between what was fair and what was required. The walk back through the service corridor was exactly the kind of moment that becomes significant later. In the retelling, in the way that transitions between states always acquire a clarity in retrospect that they lack in the experiencing. Ray pushed open the corridor door and stepped back into the showroom at approximately the point where the south utility access met the main floor, 30 feet from the meridian. The room registered his return in waves, first the engineering team nearest the vehicle, then the event staff, then the guests clustered in conversational groups, who had been pretending with varying degrees of success that nothing unusual was happening. Marcus Webb looked up from his tablet. Dana Park looked up from her position near the vehicle's rear quarter. Gerald Hoffman, standing apart from the others with his arms crossed, and his expression carrying the particular resignation of a man who has been right about something painful for a long time, saw Ray cross the floor and allowed himself something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. Ray set his tool case down beside the Meridian's rear access panel. He did not make eye contact with Marcus Webb. He did not acknowledge the guests or the cameras or the general atmosphere of a room in which over 200 people were watching him work. He crouched down, opened the case, and selected a calibration tool and a fiber optic thermal probe of the specific type, designed for accessing the battery management housing through the service aperture in the rear diffuser structure. Dana Park moved to his side without being asked, and held the aperture cover steady while he inserted the probe. He said, "What's the Sector 4 reading showing on the main display?" She said, "Nominal, 81.3. He said, "Physical temperature?" She checked the handheld unit she had been holding. 90, 2.1. He said, "Sensors 17 through 22 are drifting." She said, "All of them?" He said, 17 through 19 are drifting in the same direction. Enough to mask the delta. He withdrew the probe, selected a recalibration interface cable from the second tray of his tool case, and connected it to the service port beneath the rear diffuser. His fingers moved through the recalibration sequence with the particular fluency of a person performing an action so deeply embedded in muscle memory that conscious thought is not required the way a musician's hands know the next note before the mind has articulated it. It took 4 minutes and 30 seconds. He disconnected the interface cable. He withdrew the thermal probe. He stood up and said to Dana, "Run the startup diagnostic sequence." She typed the command. The system cycled. This time it reached step 7 of 14. Received a thermal clearance confirmation from Sector 4 of the battery housing, now reporting the correct reading of 81.3 degrees, accurate, verified, consistent with the 3 adjacent sectors, and continued through steps 8 through 14 without interruption. The dashboard illuminated fully. The powertrain management controller confirmed readiness. The battery management system released its interlock. The engineer in the driver's seat, who had never left it, looked at the initialization display and then looked up at Ray. Ray nodded. The engineer keyed the start command. The Voss Meridian started. The sound it made was not loud in the way that combustion engines announce themselves with immediate theatrical force. It arrived in layers first, a subsonic resonance felt in the chest, rather than heard by the ear. Then the controlled turbine-adjacent rise of the twin turbocharged core coming on load. Then the full harmonic integration of the combustion and electrical systems finding their shared operating state. A sound that was both ancient and completely new, the collaboration of the two most consequential propulsion technologies of the past 100 years, operating in a single coherent system. It was, by any honest accounting, one of the most extraordinary mechanical sounds that had ever been produced in that room or in any room. The guests nearest the vehicle stepped back instinctively, not from fear but from the particular physical response that humans have to genuinely powerful things operating at close range. Then the room broke. Not all at once in a rolling wave that started at the front and moved backward through the crowd. The applause arrived, and with it the kind of collective emotional release that only occurs when tension has been held long enough that its resolution produces something close to euphoria. Ray Kowalski had already stepped back from the vehicle. He was standing 6 feet away with his tool case in his hand. Watching the gauges on Dana Park's handheld unit confirmed that every parameter had settled exactly where it should be, with the expression of a man checking his work rather than receiving recognition for it. He did not turn toward the applause. He did not turn toward the cameras. Gerald Hoffman walked over and stood beside him and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said between two people who have worked together long enough to understand that the work itself is the complete statement. Margaret Calloway stood at the edge of the presentation platform for a moment that stretched longer than the room around her noticed. She was looking at Ray, not at the car, not at the investors, not at the cameras or the press pool or the live stream screens mounted above the secondary presentation stations. At Ray, and what she was experiencing in that moment was not the gratitude of a leader whose crisis had been resolved, though that was present. It was something more structural, the specific cognitive disruption that occurs when a person who has organized their perception of other people around a particular set of signals is forced to confront the inadequacy of those signals. She had built Voss on the principle of precision, the insistence that every system be evaluated on the basis of what it actually produced, rather than what it was assumed to be capable of producing. And she had spent 20 years applying that principle to engines and materials and manufacturing tolerances and financial models. And she had somehow, systematically, and without ever explicitly deciding to, exempted people from it. She had assessed Ray Kowalski on the basis of his coveralls, and his title, and his position in the building's hierarchy, and concluded that his knowledge was proportional to those signals. She had been wrong in a way that had a $200 million car and an international audience as its witness. And she understood, standing at the edge of that platform, that the error was not incidental. It was cultural. It was hers. And it was going to require more than a corrected calibration to fix. She walked to the center of the platform and took the microphone. What followed was not in any version of the prepared remarks her communications team had developed across 18 months of event planning. She spoke for 6 minutes without notes, and those 6 minutes were, by the consensus of the people who were in that room, the most consequential thing she had said in 4 years as chief executive of Voss Automotive. She began not with an apology to the investors, or a technical explanation of what had occurred, but with a precise account of what she had done that morning, the words she had used, the speed with which she had used them, and the reasoning, such as it was, that had preceded them. She said that she had seen a man in work clothes touching a vehicle she was responsible for protecting, and had responded not to the action but to the person, to what his appearance told her about who he was and what his presence in her showroom was likely to mean. She said that she had been wrong, and she named the specific error: the assumption that knowledge and value are proportional to the signals by which we recognize status. She said this slowly and clearly, and without the hedging language that public figures typically deploy when admitting error: the passive constructions, the impersonal framings, the careful distribution of responsibility across contextual factors beyond any single person's control. She named herself as the person who had made the decision, the person who had executed it publicly and without inquiry, and the person who was responsible for the culture that had made such a decision feel not only justified, but automatic. She said that Voss had spent 2 decades building a reputation for caring about what things actually were rather than what they appeared to be in its metallurgy, in its manufacturing tolerances, in its engineering philosophy, and that this principle had somehow failed to extend to the human beings who made all of those things possible. She said that was going to change, and she said it in the specific, operational way of a chief executive describing a process rather than a sentiment. New structures for technical recognition, new pathways for frontline expertise to reach decision-making levels, new accountability for the gap between the people who are credited for outcomes and the people who actually produce them. She said that the Meridian was everything she had promised it would be, and that the proof of that was sitting 40 feet behind her, running it idle, because a man named Ray Kowalski had understood it well enough to save it twice, once by trying to prevent the problem, and once by solving it after everyone else had failed. She said that the role she was creating for him was not a consolation or a public relations gesture, but an acknowledgement of a contribution that had always existed and had simply never been named. She set down the microphone. The room was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be intentional. Then the investor in the front row, the man with the $900 million stake, who had checked his watch 3 times, began to applaud, and the room followed him. Ray was standing near the south wall when Margaret stepped off the platform and walked to him. He watched her come across the floor with the same measured attention he gave to everything: not suspicious, not anticipating, simply present. She stopped in front of him and said what she had agreed to say, not as performance but as record: that the decision to fire him had been wrong, that the reasoning behind it was something the company needed to examine and correct, and that the position she had described from the platform was a genuine offer, conditional only on his willingness to accept it, and that he could take as much time as he needed to consider it. Ray looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "A machine always tells you the truth if you're willing to listen. So does a person." Margaret held his gaze. "I know that now," she said. Ray said, "Then we'll figure the rest out." Across the showroom, the Meridian's engine note settled into its operational idle, steady, precise, perfectly calibrated, every system in communication with every other system in the continuous mutual verification that constitutes a well-designed machine at rest. Dana Park was logging the corrected sensor data on her tablet, noting the variance, noting the recalibration, noting the outcome. Gerald Hoffman had found a cup of coffee from somewhere and was standing near the service corridor door with the expression of a man who has been at this long enough to find satisfaction in quiet endings. The investors were moving in clusters toward the presentation platform where the Meridian sat, asking questions of the Voss technical team in the engaged, specific way that people ask questions when they have decided they are interested. The cameras were still running. The live stream was still live. The story the room was telling itself had changed completely in the span of 45 minutes. The Meridian was demonstrated twice more that afternoon, both times flawlessly. By 4 o'clock, the preliminary letters of intent from the assembled investor group represented a total commitment figure that exceeded the company's most optimistic projections by a margin of 31%. The hum of conversation in the showroom carried the particular energy of a room in which large decisions had just been made and were in the process of being formalized. Margaret was at the center of it, managing 3 conversations simultaneously, in the way she always managed complex situations with focus, with precision, with the particular kind of authority that is most secure when it has just survived a challenge. But periodically, across the arc of the afternoon, she looked toward the east side of the room where Ray Kowalski stood with Gerald Hoffman and Dana Park, in the quiet way of people who are more comfortable talking about systems than about recognition, and the look she gave that corner of the room was different from the one she would have given it that morning. It carried something that had not been there before, not admiration exactly, not the uncomplicated warmth of sudden conversion, but the more durable thing that follows from the recognition of a genuine error in one's own calibration. The awareness, specific and situated and impossible to unlearn, that competence is not a function of its packaging. When Ray Kowalski left the building that evening, the last thing he did before walking through the lobby door was look back at the Meridian. Sitting under its now gentled lighting in the center of the polished floor, and he gave it the same quiet nod. He gave all the machines he worked on not sentiment, exactly, more a form of acknowledgement between 2 systems that had found their way to the correct operating state and could now rest. He pushed through the door. Outside, the air was cold and clear, and his truck was in the second level of the parking structure in the same space it always was. And his daughter was at home with her grandmother waiting to hear how the day had ended. He drove slowly through the structure, taking the ramp at the same measured pace he took everything. And when he emerged onto the street and the building receded in his mirrors, he let out a single long breath, not a sigh of relief, more the kind of breath a person takes when a system they have been monitoring for a long time finally settles into stable operating range. He called his daughter from the traffic light at the end of the block. She answered on the second ring. He told her that he had gone back because he chose to, because there was a problem only he could fix, and it was the right thing to do, and that people sometimes make mistakes about other people, and what matters is whether they are willing to say so. His daughter was 9 years old, and she absorbed this with the practical directness of a child who has not yet learned to complicate simple truths. "Did you fix it?" she asked. "I fixed it," he said. "Good," she said. And that was enough. The day had ended the way most true things end, not with a clean conclusion but with the particular open stillness that arrives when the work has been done correctly and there is nothing left to prove. The machine had told the truth. He had listened, and in the end, that was the only credential that had ever mattered, not the title on a badge, not the fabric of a uniform, not the floor of a building a person was permitted to stand on, just the willingness to pay attention to what was actually there. To stay present with the truth of a system long enough to understand what it needed, and to say so clearly even when no one in the room was prepared to hear it. Ray Kowalski had done that. A machine had confirmed it, and a room full of the most powerful people in the automotive world had watched it happen and understood, in the particular way that public events sometimes force understanding, that this was not a story about a car. That was enough.